At 14:15 hours, August 30th, 1945, on a narrow street in the outskirts of Yokohama, a silence hung heavier than the late summer humidity. Dust clung to broken windowsills, smoke lingered from fires that had only recently been extinguished, and the rubble of collapsed homes bore witness to years of merciless air raids. A group of thin, wide-eyed children crept hesitantly from the shadows. Their wooden sandals scraped the ground as they stepped into the open, clutching each other's hands. Then, something utterly unthinkable. A convoy of olive-drab U.S. Army trucks screeched to a halt. Soldiers in sweat-stained khaki uniforms climbed down, rifles slung but barrels lowered. Instead of hostility, the men carried metal containers, scoops, and of all things, ice cream. The children froze, stunned. The same men whose aircraft had burned their cities were now kneeling, smiling, and offering them cold, sweet salvation. Mothers watched in disbelief from shattered doorways, unable to reconcile the brutality of war with the gentleness unfolding before them. U.S. Army Signal Corps photo, September 1945. The scene was surreal, like an image torn from two different realities colliding. Just months before, these children had been taught that Americans were demons, giants who would kill without hesitation, who would dishonor their families, destroy their culture, and obliterate everything sacred. Japanese propaganda, spread relentlessly by the imperial government, painted the United States as a cruel, merciless enemy, bent on extermination. The surrender of August 15th had silenced those voices, but fear still lingered in every home. Now as vanilla scoops slid into battered tin cups, melting in the heat, the narrative shattered. Imperial Ministry of Education Circular, 1944. The wider context made this moment all the more astonishing. By August 1945, Japan lay in ruins. The Pacific War had consumed nearly 8 million Japanese lives, military and civilian alike. Entire urban centers, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, had been reduced to ash by relentless B-29 incendiary raids. Over 100,000 civilians perished in a single night of fire in Tokyo, March 9, 1945, the deadliest air raid in human history. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Food production had collapsed. Rice rations fell to a mere 1.5 go per person per day, less than 450 grams, leaving millions malnourished. Markets offered nothing but dried sweet potatoes, millet, and thin soups. Many families starved quietly in their homes. Children scavenged in ruins, trading scraps of cloth or bits of coal for a few mouthfuls of barley. Tokyo Prefectural Relief Report, 1945. The Japanese government until the very end had drilled civilians to resist an American invasion to the last breath. Operation Ketsugo, the National Defense Plan, ordered women and children to take up bamboo spears, ready to repel Marines storming the beaches. Leaflets warned of atrocities that would come once the barbarians landed. Parents were told to kill their daughters to spare them from capture. The population braced for annihilation, and then suddenly surrender. The emperor's voice, heard for the first time on August 15th, spoke of enduring the unendurable. The war ended, not with final combat on Japanese soil, but with silence and occupation. NHK radio broadcast transcript, August 15, 1945. For ordinary civilians, the first sight of American soldiers was drenched in dread. Rumors swirled in the burned-out alleys, stories of women assaulted, of children enslaved, of culture erased. Yet when the trucks of the 8th Army rolled through, what emerged instead was discipline, order, and an almost bewildering show of generosity. U.S. soldiers handed out chocolate bars from K-rations, chewing gum, and powdered milk. But above all, the cold sweetness of ice cream, churned in makeshift field kitchens, using refrigeration units designed by American engineers like Frederick McKinley Jones of Thermo King, a technology born for war logistics, now turned to comfort hungry civilians. Quartermaster Corps Field Report, September 1945. To the Japanese children, the taste was foreign, alien. Many had never seen such a luxury. Sugar had disappeared from daily life years earlier. Dairy products were scarce, considered Western oddities. Yet here it was, creamy and soft, served not by demons, but by young men barely older than their elder brothers, boys from Iowa, Kansas, and New Jersey. Their uniforms smelled of sweat and machine oil, their boots heavy on broken streets, but their eyes were warm, their laughter disarming. One boy licked the sweet from his fingers, eyes wide, before breaking into a smile. His mother wept silently in the doorway. Yokohama Civilian Diary, September 1945. What made this moment so powerful was not just the food itself, but what it symbolized. For soldiers who had endured Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, who had seen comrades fall to kamikaze planes, machine gun nests and caves filled with fire, the act of sharing ice cream was a gesture of humanity reclaimed. War had hardened them, but now in the ashes of Japan, they extended a hand instead of a rifle. The civilians, conditioned to expect the sword, now tasted mercy. The broader military context added weight to this small scene. The U.S. occupation force numbered nearly 350,000 men by late 1945. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, had ordered strict discipline, no looting, no assaults, no humiliation of civilians. "We are liberators, not destroyers," he wrote in his directive, a deliberate effort to contrast American behavior with the Imperial Army's own record in China and Southeast Asia. MacArthur Occupation Directives, September 1945. His orders filtered down to field kitchens and mess halls, where quartermaster corps units, supported by refrigeration equipment and the miracle of mass production, prepared not just food for GIs, but surplus rations for starving locals. Behind each cup of ice cream lay the weight of American industry. The United States had produced 135 billion pounds of food during the war, enough to feed not just its 12 million servicemen, but also its allies through Lend-Lease. Refrigeration units, perfected in Detroit factories, churned endlessly on supply ships and depots. Engineers and technicians, men and women working night shifts in Cleveland, Buffalo and Minneapolis, had built systems to preserve meat, milk, and eggs across the Pacific. Now those same systems, redirected in peacetime, brought relief to civilians who had once been enemies. U.S. Department of Agriculture Report, 1946. For the Japanese, the shock was existential. Their government had told them Americans would burn shrines, destroy traditions, and treat them as subhuman. Instead, they were given sweets. For a generation of children, the first contact with the occupiers was not terror, but a taste of something forbidden and delightful. It was a quiet moment that rewrote the narrative of an entire people, and yet beneath the laughter of children licking cold spoons, there lingered an uneasy question. Why would the conquerors, who held absolute power, extend kindness to those they had vanquished? Was this a strategy, a weapon of influence, or something deeper, a sign of what truly separated the American war machine from the empire it had destroyed? The answer to that question, the hidden advantage behind ice cream, radios, and rations, would emerge not in this first encounter, but in the months that followed, as technology, logistics, and psychology fused into something the Japanese could neither predict nor resist. The children finished their cups, the soldiers climbed back into their trucks, engines roared, dust rose, and the convoy rolled on. Mothers whispered to each other, still stunned. For a nation once ready to fight to the last bamboo spear, the war was over, but the occupation had only just begun. And in that simple act of sharing ice cream in the ruins of Yokohama, the seeds of something far greater were planted, seeds that would change not just the fate of Japan, but the entire balance of the post-war world. September 1945. The guns were silent, but in Japan hunger still roared louder than artillery. Behind every act of mercy by the occupying Americans lay a hidden advantage that few civilians could comprehend. The sight of U.S. soldiers scooping ice cream for children was not just an oddity, it was the visible edge of a logistical machine that had crushed an empire. Where Japan's supply chains had collapsed into starvation and scarcity, the United States wielded abundance like a weapon, powered by industry, engineering, and an army of invisible hands on the home front. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The secret wasn't just the food itself, it was the cold. Refrigeration, standardized by American inventors like Frederick McKinley Jones of Thermo King, had transformed war. By 1944, fleets of refrigerated trucks, trailers, and shipboard units moved across oceans and through jungles, keeping meat, milk, and even ice cream intact. Jones's portable cooling units, built with rugged simplicity, became staples of the Quartermaster Corps. In the Pacific, floating refrigeration plants supplied island garrisons, ensuring that morale remained intact with fresh produce, while Japanese soldiers gnawed on dried fish and rice balls. Quartermaster Corps Technical Report, 1945. Contrast was everything. By the war's end, U.S. production had churned out more than 200,000 refrigerated trailers and over 15,000 mobile kitchen units. Japan, isolated by naval blockade, could scarcely deliver rice from Formosa to the home islands without submarine attack. Soldiers on Pacific atolls often fought on half rations, while children in Tokyo learned to stretch barley into watery porridge. Imperial Army Logistics Memo, 1945. The Americans, by comparison, could land in Okinawa with chilled beef, cartons of milk powder, chocolate, and yes, ice cream freezers. The psychological blow of this abundance was immense. Japanese prisoners of war, interviewed after capture, often described their shock at seeing enemy troops eating luxuries that imperial soldiers had not tasted in years. Dramatized composite. But refrigeration was only one spoke in the wheel. The larger hub was the entire U.S. supply doctrine, what military planners called the logistical tail. For every combat soldier, there were at least 7 support personnel. Engineers, mechanics, and cooks kept the war machine alive. From Detroit's auto plants to the sprawling quartermaster depots in Oakland and New Orleans, armies of workers built the backbone of victory. General Brigham Somervell, head of the Army Service Forces, famously declared, "Logistics is victory." War Department Statement, 1944. The ice cream in Yokohama was not charity. It was proof of a system so powerful that even in peacetime occupation, it could overflow. The Japanese could not fathom it. For years their doctrine prized spirit over sustenance, willpower over material. Soldiers were told that rice balls and courage would overcome machine guns and tanks. It was the Bushido ideal, transposed into military logistics, but reality proved harsher. By 1945, many units fought with empty stomachs. Diaries found on fallen troops told of gnawing hunger, men too weak to march, and officers rationing handful. Captured soldier diary, late 1944. Meanwhile, American forces feasted comparatively well. At Saipan, Marines stormed ashore with K-rations, canned meat, biscuits, powdered coffee, chewing gum. A captured Japanese officer marveled not at rifle, but at canned peaches. Dramatized composite. Nowhere was this imbalance clearer than during the Battle of Okinawa, April 1 to June 22, 1945. On the southern tip of the Ryukyu Islands, 1.5 million civilians were caught in the crossfire. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, fortified caves and ridges, prepared to bleed the Americans dry. But as the battle dragged on, food became a weapon. Japanese soldiers, cut off by naval bombardment, starved in their tunnels. Civilians scoured fields for grass and roots. Okinawa Civil Defense Report, June 1940. The Americans meanwhile set up field kitchens just behind the lines. Mobile refrigeration trucks hummed under camouflage nets, keeping meat fresh for GIs even as artillery shells fell nearby. Engineers like those at Carrier Corporation had designed portable cold storage units, resilient enough to function under bombardment. Bureau of Ships Report, 1945. One Marine veteran recalled stepping out of the mud after days of combat to find a mess tent serving ice cream sundaes, churned by gasoline-powered machines. It was madness, he said, to eat ice cream while men were dying yards away. But it reminded us we weren't animals. U.S. Marine Oral History Interview, 1947. For the Japanese defenders, such abundance was unthinkable. In cave hospitals, surgeons amputated without anesthetic, nurses rationed sips of stagnant water. When civilians saw American soldiers later handing chocolate to their children, they understood this was not just military victory, it was civilizational contrast. Technically the systems were marvels. A standard Army mobile refrigeration truck, model M1944, could carry 10 tons of perishable goods, with insulation rated to hold -10 degrees Fahrenheit for 72 hours without power. Portable freezers on Liberty ships could preserve 250,000 pounds of frozen beef for weeks. Thermo King units, built in Minnesota, ran on diesel, their compressors engineered for minimal maintenance in tropical climates. Technical Manual TM9 on 294. While Japanese units boiled seaweed to survive, American GIs bit into cold apples in jungle heat. By the time occupation began, these same systems pivoted to humanitarian use. U.S. engineers established relief kitchens in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka, distributing surplus rations. Ice cream appeared again, this time as policy. Quartermasters understood its symbolic value. It softened hostility, bridged fear with familiarity, and carried an unspoken message. America could feed what Japan could not. U.S. Army Occupation Report, October 1945. The treat became a quiet propaganda tool, though no leaflet announced it. Each spoonful said, "We bring plenty, not destruction." Enemy disbelief filled diaries and post-war interrogations. One former Japanese officer later recalled, "We were told Americans were beasts, yet my daughter came home with candy from their hands." It was impossible to reconcile. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogation, 1946. Dramatized composite, to the engineers who built the machine. There was vindication. They had labored in obscurity. Draftsmen, machinists, refrigeration specialists, never firing a shot, but enabling a victory measured in calories, morale, and shock. And shock mattered. At Okinawa, casualty figures were staggering: over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians dead, compared to 12,500 American troops. Yet beyond numbers, the sight of enemy soldiers well-fed, rested, and still sharing luxuries destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility. Spirit could not defeat refrigeration. Courage could not match logistics. As the children of Yokohama licked melting ice cream under the watchful eyes of their mothers, the hidden advantage became visible in its simplest form. This was not just dessert. It was the culmination of industrial power, engineering brilliance, and a doctrine that believed soldiers fought best when nourished in body and spirit. But as the months passed, another dimension emerged, psychological and strategic. The ice cream, the chocolate, the powdered milk were not merely charity. They became tools of occupation, reshaping trust, dismantling fear, and bending the defeated nation toward cooperation. And that transformation, from terror to trust, was perhaps the most decisive victory of all. The war had ended, but for Japan, the true battle was only beginning. A struggle for survival, dignity and identity beneath the shadow of occupation. By late 1945, the American presence spread across the ruins of cities that had once glowed with lantern festivals and factory chimneys. Soldiers were everywhere, directing traffic at intersections, guarding train depots, standing watch outside government ministries. But unlike the imperial troops who had occupied Nanjing, Manila, or Singapore, these men were not looting, not burning, not brutalizing. They were handing out rations, repairing infrastructure, and most bewilderingly, serving ice cream to children. U.S. Army Occupation Report, 1940. This gesture was not trivial. It was strategy in the form of sweetness. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, understood the delicate psychology of conquest. "We must show the Japanese people not vengeance, but justice," he declared, insisting on strict military discipline among his men. MacArthur Headquarters Directive, September 1945. The act of sharing food, especially luxuries like ice cream, became a subtle instrument of psychological warfare. It eroded the myths planted by years of propaganda, replacing fear with reluctant admiration. The impact rippled quickly. In the first months after surrender, civilians expected the occupiers to strip their homes bare, as Japanese troops had done in Asia. Instead, they saw Americans queuing politely at mess halls, donating medical supplies, and opening soup kitchens. When children carried home scoops of frozen vanilla from U.S. field kitchens, parents were forced to question everything they had been told. "If these men are monsters," one Tokyo schoolteacher wrote in her diary, then why do they feed our hungry? Tokyo Teachers Journal, October 1945. The psychological power of food, especially during famine, cannot be overstated. Studies conducted after the war confirmed that Japanese morale had collapsed not only from bombing, but from hunger. Rice rations had fallen to levels unseen in modern history, and malnutrition left millions weakened. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Nutrition Section, 1946. The sudden arrival of abundance, milk, bread, chocolate, ice cream, was nothing short of miraculous. American food became an unspoken language of dominance, translating victory into compassion, and compassion into influence. Engineers and technicians remained the silent architects of this transformation. The men and women who had designed mobile refrigeration units, perfected dehydration processes, and scaled food production to industrial levels, had not only won a war, they were now shaping a peace. Factories in Wisconsin, Ohio, and New York, that had once shipped canned rations to the front, now supplied relief goods to Japanese ports. Carrier Corporation's refrigeration technology, born for bombers and Navy ships, now powered cold storage depots in Yokohama Harbor. Bureau of Supplies Report, 1946. But food was more than sustenance, it was symbolism. Every bite of ice cream whispered a message. America had conquered not through cruelty, but through capacity. Soldiers who weeks earlier had killed in the jungles of the Philippines now handed sweets to toddlers who had never seen sugar. This paradox was not lost on Japanese intellectual. Philosopher Shunsuke Tsurumi later remarked, "It was not the atom bomb that changed Japan, but the abundance of America." To be defeated by such power was humiliating, yet strangely reassuring. Post-war interview, 19. The Axis defeat had always carried a psychological dimension, but nowhere was it clearer than in the streets of Japan. German generals interrogated after the war expressed disbelief at American logistics, calling it warfare by factories. Allied interrogation reports, 1946. Japanese officers echoed the same spirit. They admitted, could not withstand the weight of enemy stomachs filled with meat and ice cream. The Bushido Code had no answer for refrigeration. Over time, these encounters began to soften the face of occupation. The children who had first trembled at the sight of American soldiers began to wave at them on street corners. Families who had hidden daughters indoors now accepted rations from GIs with cautious gratitude. The ice cream moment, repeated in countless towns, built a foundation of uneasy trust. Where fear might have bred rebellion, sweetness bred compliance. The human cost, however, was never forgotten. For many Japanese, kindness from Americans was haunting precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the horror they had endured from their own government. They remembered starving while their leaders promised victory, remembered being told Americans would enslave them, only to find Americans keeping their children alive. This irony carried both relief and shame. Japanese Civilian Diary, Kyoto, 1946. On the American side, soldiers too were transformed. Men who had fought bitterly at Iwo Jima or Guadalcanal now cradled children in their arms, their rifles slung harmlessly at their sides. Some veterans later admitted that handing out food healed something inside them, that sharing ice cream with a child helped wash away the memories of bayonet charges and burning villages. Marine Veterans Oral History Project, 1950. Strategically, the impact reached far beyond the ruined streets of Yokohama. By feeding the defeated population, the United States secured not just peace but influence. A generation of Japanese children grew up associating America not solely with mushroom clouds, but with chocolate bars and ice cream cones. This soft power laid the groundwork for a US-Japanese alliance that would reshape the Pacific during the Cold War. The same factories that once produced ration cans would later help fuel Japan's reconstruction, supplying not destruction but development. U.S. State Department Reconstruction Report, 1947. The legacy continued into modern warfare. In Korea, in Vietnam, and in the Persian Gulf, American planners recognized that food and logistics were as much weapons as bullets and bombs. Mobile refrigeration,
pioneered in the Pacific War, became standard for every deployment. And the lesson of Japan, that mercy could be as devastating as firepower, echoed in policy decisions for decades. By the 1990s, when U.S. troops rolled into Kuwait during Operation Desert Storm, they carried the same logistical edge, an army that marched not on empty stomachs, but on cold sodas and hot meals, supplied by an unbroken chain of factories, technicians, and transport ships. The philosophy was clear: feed soldiers well, and they will fight harder. Feed civilians, and they may never become enemies again. Pentagon Logistics White Paper, 1991. In the end, the story of ice cream in Yokohama was never about dessert. It was about the human face of an industrial juggernaut, about engineers in Minnesota and machinists in Detroit, who unknowingly wielded as much influence as generals in Tokyo. It was about children who expected violence but received kindness. It was about the power of abundance to conquer not just armies, but hearts. A Japanese mother, watching her son lick the last drops from a tin cup, is said to have whispered through tears, "They have taken everything from us, and yet they give us this." Dramatized composite, her words capture the paradox of defeat, humiliation, survival, and the first fragile seeds of reconciliation. The lesson endures. In modern war, victory is not only decided by firepower or courage, but by the invisible engines of industry, by the cold hum of refrigeration, by the taste of something sweet in the ashes of destruction. And so in the ruins of Yokohama, where children once trembled before foreign soldiers, America's most unexpected weapon was revealed: not a bomb, not a bullet, but a scoop of melting ice cream,